So I gave you my questions earlier. I'm curious if, in your looking over them, if there was like something in particular that sort of struck you, or that you were like, yeah, like I can talk about this, or I want to talk about this.
I thought they were all really. I'm going to give you the annoying answer and say I thought they were all really interesting questions. The funny one that comes to mind right off the bat is the which books would I grab if the house were burning down?
Yeah.
And I thought of, for some reason, I couldn't think of a witty retort to that, because I think that often it's the desert island question, like which two books would you bring to a desert island? And Heather McHugh has this great response where, I forget, she says one book and then she says the other thing would be Thompson's Practical Guide to Shipbuilding. So that's what she would bring. So I don't know, I was trying to think of some like how to like save my burning building, or like, you know, how to access a fire hose readily would be one book. But
the way I always think of it is like, it's almost a question of sentimentality. Like, what books do you feel most, not that you would want to read over and over and over again, but these would be the books that you'd be stuck with for the rest of your life? Because I think that is a sort of silly and hard question.
Yeah.
But is there a book that's like in your house that you feel that you would want to save? Like,
I'd want to grab a milk crate of them. That's the problem. I think the two that immediately pop to mind. There's three. One is Elizabeth Bishop's collected poems, and then Emily Dickinson's poems. And then probably Ferdinand the Bull for sentimental reasons, since you brought up sentimentality, since I think Ferdinand is probably still my favorite literary character of all time. Ferdinand is this bull that instead of acting all bull-like, likes to go off and sit under a tree and smell the flowers instead of running around and romping with the other bulls. And then the dudes from Madrid come because they have to select the next bull, the next macho bull for the bullfight, you know, in the city. And all the bulls are romping around and they're looking, and Ferdinand goes off and he sits down and he gets stung on the ass by a bee and just starts ripping around because he's in pain, and the guys are like, that's the one. They pick Ferdinand. So they take Ferdinand to the bull ring, and then of course he goes into the bull ring, and he's huge now and he's big, and everybody's all excited. He just goes right into the middle of the ring and he sits down and he smells this one little flower that he finds there, and that's, you know, and then everybody's distraught and they boo and they end up carting him back to the country and, you know, jettisoning him there. So whatever, it had resonance for me as a kid, and I do think that that idea of being somewhat peripheral to the thing that you maybe are supposed to be, or that the larger, it sounds, this is way advanced, that the larger culture sort of emphasizes, or what feels mainstream or right or regular. I think I enjoy being, part of the thing about being a poet, I think, is feeling somewhat peripheral and enjoying being on the periphery where you can observe rather than necessarily, it's an activity, but you're not necessarily, I don't know, there's something about being outside of things and then being able to look at them more carefully that I think appeals to me and feels somewhat innate to being a poet, or essential to being a poet, is this idea of somewhat being outside of things and observing. And not necessarily having, this is odd to be a teacher too, right? Not necessarily having attention focused on you, but being able to sort of focus your attention on the world. It's a way of being within yourself, but focusing your attention away from yourself. And that somehow feels essential as to being a poet, I think. And so it's weird sometimes to be a teacher where that sense of like, you're on stage all the time. That feels a little different, but I enjoy that as well, I guess.
Well, and you have the text to sort of deflect
to,
right?
Yeah, and that's also a very sort of old school way of thinking about teaching too, is that you're the focus of attention, and that's not really how I teach anyway. So I end up thinking that, you know, being a good teacher is being more a facilitator than anything. So, and that's paying attention to the group and what's going on with the dynamic and the text that's in front of you. So,
do you have particular texts that you feel excited to teach every year, or that you have like favorite texts that you go back to when you teach, in the same way that maybe you feel sentimental towards Ferdinand?
Yeah, I think so. I think Joan Didion is somebody who I teach in essay writing a lot. I teach high school. I teach at a private school in the Bronx, and I teach 9th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade. And the 9th grade is more of sort of a great books kind of curriculum. So it's, I don't have as much liberty to sort of change and exchange and bring in new texts as I would otherwise. So with the electives, I think there's certain things that I come back to, like with essay writing, and teaching Didion's On Keeping a Notebook is an essay that I teach all the time. I love, James Baldwin has a great essay about Sonny Liston and Floyd Patterson. It's basically about Floyd Patterson, the boxer, but it's sort of in preparation for their fight, and that sort of contrast in those two styles. I love teaching that. Brent Staples has an essay, and I teach it every year, and I'm totally going to space out on the title, but it's basically, it's like whistling Vivaldi. It's basically about being an African-American man and having to be used to walking the streets of Brooklyn and whistling this Vivaldi tune to make people on the street feel more comfortable as they're approaching a black man on the street, so that at night, so they know he's safe if they hear him whistling Vivaldi. So there are a couple of texts like that. And poets, I mean, I love Bishop, I love Frank O'Hara. I love Gerard Manley Hopkins, who confuses the hell out of kids, but just musically I think he's wonderful. And, so yeah, they're definitely, I guess those are some of the ones that come to mind. I think probably in some ways, in terms of having a fairly traditional education, upbringing, whatever, we didn't do a lot of poetry in school, and I think that, it was sort of, and still to this day it makes sense, right? You teach sort of Emily and Walt as like the aunt and uncle, mother and father of American poetry, right? And sort of as a teenager, I think I was much more into Whitman, and the yawp and the blab and the constant voice, and I love that still. But I think the older I got, I realized that, Dickinson was somebody who kind of confused me at first, and then I think as I got older, I kind of liked being confused. And I liked how she made me think. I liked how spare she was and how musical she was. And I think that she still feels to me like the benchmark of both what you're doing with music and meaning, and how, being conscious of yourself and the world is never necessarily a clear-cut thing. And so I think that there's sort of an affinity that I have with her that I've got as I've gotten older. Both what's tangible and palpable about her music, and yet what's mysterious about her work. And teaching her is great because I don't feel like I teach her. I feel like I'm still trying to understand her, which I hope with the kids helps, because then they see me struggling with it and they're okay struggling with it too. And Bishop, I think just her acute way of looking. I was talking before about feeling somewhat, feeling peripheral, and yet also enjoying being that feeling on the outside, trying to look in and trying to understand things. And I feel like that her little bit of anxiety but patience in terms of looking at the world. I love the sort of muted personality that sort of, there's not a huge persona or a huge voice sometimes in those poems, but just the way that she looks and at the world, and how she's patient, and how descriptive she is, how smart she is. I just think that sometimes reading those poems over and over again, this sense of intelligence and wonder and grace just sort of accrues gradually. And I was totally, I don't even remember when I first read her. I think I first read her in college. I'm pretty sure that I had some professors in college who liked her. And then again in grad school. But I think that, even something like a poem like The Sandpiper, this sort of innocuous moment of watching these birds like sort of run into the waves and run back and run in and run back, and how she can describe that, or The Fish, which is sort of the classic poem of like what it means to look at something so much that it ends up looking back at you. Almost like that that's for me, that poem, The Fish, is sort of like our American version of Rilke's, you must change your life, when you're looking at that sculpture and finally you look at a thing hard enough and it ends up looking back at you. That's what I love about her. I think I get that same sort of effect with her. So.
Well, she's also, you've spent some time in Maine, and she's sort of got the Maine vibe too. Do you think you might have some thoughts about place more generally, like in your own work, and maybe how you relate to place in other work? Or is that even something that is sort of on your radar?
I think it's more. I think it's a great question. It's more on my radar. I think not. I feel like I write well, or if I write well, if I'm going to write well, if that happens, it's often not at home. It's often away from home. It's often in a place where I'm a little unfamiliar. I mean, I don't think it's it's not quite as black and white as like city country kind of thing. Like I need to get out of the city in order to write, or I need nature in order to write. But there's something about going to other places that sort of helps generate material. And it's not necessarily place bound. Although I find that I love landscapes that are near water. I love being by the water. And I think I like being with landscapes that where I feel smaller than the landscape, or that somehow being a person in a landscape feels as though the proportions are more, landscape feels more important, humanity feels a little less important. And I don't know if that really makes much sense, but I think being in a city where I'm surrounded by people is great and wonderful and motivating and energizing, but I love to get away from that and feel a little bit more solitude, a little bit more a sense that we haven't paved over everything around me isn't necessarily man-made kind of thing. And so I love, I spent 2 years up in Provincetown, and I love the coast there. I love Maine. I went to Bishop's maternal grandmother's house last summer. In Nova Scotia, where she spent some time as a kid, and that was like a dream, to sort of literally take naps in the room that she, her bedroom, right? And to work in this house, and to actually go into the kitchen where that poem Sestina was written, and like I had a total like scream moment, like when I walked into the house and the woman who runs the place was like, yeah, this is the kitchen from Sestina and stuff like that. So I spent 2 weeks there and traveled around and retraced her journey that's in the Moose, where she takes the bus from Nova Scotia to Boston, so something about those kind of maritime-ish landscapes, I think, are appealing. And, what I said before about it not necessarily entering into the work, that's probably a little disingenuous, because I think that in my book, Provincetown sort of figures it looms large. Especially there's a large central poem. Poem is Aporia between two lighthouses. And it's sort of literally and metaphorically, it's set between two lighthouses that are at the end at the tip of Cape Cod, and so I think that place sort of figures both literally and then metaphorically. I like that idea of being on the edge of a landscape and being on the edge of the land and being near the water.